Right, thank you very much. Okay, I have my phone up here as a timekeeping device. Part of my thesis here, though, is that most of the choices and actions and decisions that people make are fast and automatic. So while I will promise not to be distracted by any messages that come through, I'm actually in no position to promise that. Anyway, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Some disclosures: I have consulted for the following organizations. They're listed alphabetically, but I will actually be talking about some of the work related to projects with Ajinomoto and bear crop science, although I think the processes that I'm describing here would apply to pretty much any organization in your space. So I said I would be talking about fast and automatic processes. In psychology, we often make a distinction between what's sometimes called System 1, which are fast and automatic processes, intuition, habits, emotions, things that happen in a matter of milliseconds, and slower processes, sometimes simply called System 2, that are more deliberative. So let me give you an example of a deliberative process, and this will be especially true for those of you who are listening in your second or third language. If English is not your first language, it's a little bit of extra effort for you to hear me and maybe even to read these. If English is your first language, it's perhaps almost effortless in System 1. But let me go to a System 2 activity and actually read my key takeaways ahead of time to give you a bit of the lay of the land. This will probably be the most words I have on any of my slides. But here's the outline. Human decision processes are largely fast and automatic. Fast and automatic processes will not make optimal choices for food or for anything. So that's the connection to the title of my talk. Point 2, social media isn't the main problem. We've had these problems for a very long time, millennia. And more information isn't the main solution. We need more information, but it's not the main solution. And then point 3, influencing fast and automatic human processes should be a central objective of communication strategies. One set of potentially effective approaches involve deactivating disgust. And I'll give you some details on all of this as we go through. But I wanted to start with a news story that I saw in CNN related to Ajinomoto just the other day. And if you live in the US, you have almost certainly seen menus or store signs that say this: no MSG, that is no monosodium glutamate. And I'll use this example to bring to life what I'm describing. No MSG has become a fixture on Chinese food restaurant signage around the country, and it is by now well understood that the actual risks of monosodium glutamate are actually not well documented and probably don't really exist at all in the levels that consumers would be consuming them. And yet there is this widespread concern in the United States, at least, and in some other countries, and has been for decades, that there is some risk. And the question is, how could this happen? So I'll talk a little bit about the causes in terms of fast and automatic processes, and then I'll talk a little bit about the strategies for getting out of a situation like this, and some of these indeed are what Ajinomoto and their partners, I think, are effectively doing and appropriately doing. So in terms of the cause, going back to the 70s and 80s, people were indeed seeing headlines that MSG posed some risk. There was a famous letter written to the New England Journal of Medicine by a physician who said he's concerned about it. He sometimes feels sick. He feels after eating at Chinese food restaurants. A condition was even given a name, Chinese restaurant syndrome or something to that effect. And based on a case and story like this, there were headlines through the 80s, so people saw it. But it's not primarily an issue of the headlines. There are a variety of other things going on in this case that involve fast and automatic processes. Let me spell out a few of them. MSG, monosodium glutamate, it's a chemical name. People have some degree of negative association with chemicals, at least in terms of things that they would want to eat. They want to eat non-chemical things like salt and water. Sorry, there's your biology joke for you. It's the best I can do. There were all kinds of anecdotes. Everybody knew somebody who claimed to get headaches or diarrhea after eating MSG. So the anecdotes are out there, and people find stories very compelling, especially when there seems to be this basic plausibility to the story based on just the chemical name and a couple of headlines. So stories, that's part 3 in the fast and automatic arsenal that leaves us very prone to believing these sorts of things. But there's more. The signs started appearing. So even the marketers at the Chinese food restaurants started saying, no MSG. Enough of our customers are asking for it. We may as well just bite the bullet and do it. And once a number of them start doing it, people start seeing it and saying, oh, it must be a thing. I must need to avoid MSG. So they start avoiding it. And then point 5, it eventually becomes a habit. And for reasons that they don't necessarily understand, they've never experienced symptoms themselves, but people find themselves regularly asking for no MSG or avoiding it. It's all very fast and automatic. People are not making careful, evidence-based choices when it comes to food. And the last fast and automatic process I want to mention in this case, which may be particularly relevant, is that there is a human tendency to distrust outgroups, people not like yourself. The harsh version of that is racism, and there is likely an aspect of that here, distrust of Chinese Americans in the United States. That distrust goes back decades and is well documented. So what do you do if you're a company or even a public health advocate who wants to address a public concern that has been arrived at through fast and automatic processes? Well, you certainly have to get your facts straight, and the facts matter. So in the case of Ajinomoto, you would, and the makers of monosodium glutamate, you would want to get medical organizations like the International Headache Society to say, there's no association between MSG and headaches. But that's probably not going to get you very far, because to the public, the International Headache Society sounds more like a comedy troupe than a medical group. So that's not going to get you a whole lot of resonance. What you need to do, and facts, of course, weren't the problem in the first place. So what you need to do is speak to fast and automatic processes and build stories and narratives around that. And this organization has done quite a lot of that background work. And this story came out just on Saturday in CNN. This is not a sponsored story. This is a story that a reporter decided to take up because the organization had done some good quality background communication work, telling the story and telling the truth in a way that would resonate with people. So we have at least 3 aspects here that are about addressing the fast and automatic processes that can potentially change people's minds. So the first one is calling out racism. So what you're doing here is trying to identify an opposing moral concern that might actually work in your favor. And in this case, it does. It's calling out racism against Chinese Americans and saying that's part of the story of how MSG came to be maligned, and there's a plausible case for that. And the reporter is free to write about this, and the reporter finds it very plausible, and tells that story and says racism is part of it here. And Americans don't want to be racist. Many of us are, but most of us don't want to be and don't identify ourselves as racism. So this is something we want to distance ourselves from, and it resonates quickly and automatically. A second thing that you would want to do as part of a strategy like this to deactivate disgust for an ingredient is remind people just how natural that product actually is. Of course, if you read this story, you will see lots of that. Glutamate appears in tomatoes and Parmesan cheese, in breast milk. There's nothing more natural than breast milk. So that's a story the organization tells. And the third piece here is emphasizing the actual familiarity of this product and the normality of it. So you talk about chefs, people like public figures, people like the late, great Anthony Bourdain, may he rest in peace, talking about how MSG is an important ingredient in the foods that he loves and uses. And you make it sound familiar. That is not really a fact-based, evidence-based story. That is a fast and automatic-based communication story. Okay, so I thought it was important to sort of spell out the general thesis and give you a case of how this might play out. I do a bunch of work around anti-GMO sentiment and other issues in non-adoption or concern about agricultural technologies, and I believe the stories are the same there. I'm plugging a talk here. I'll be giving a webinar for Today's Dietitian on Thursday with my colleague Brandon McFadden, who's an agricultural economist, And we'll be spelling that out, and I'm actually going to give you a preview of some of that material here. Okay, let me sort of slow down for a minute and spell out just what some of these fast and automatic processes are that lead people to find headlines and such so compelling, and lead so many people to have their own personal food policies that are grounded in nothing other than intuition and very often false ideas. So here are some examples to give you an idea of what I mean. This woman is angry, and you can see it immediately. I didn't need to tell you she was angry. You also didn't need to look at this picture and say, I wonder what mood this person is experiencing. You didn't even ask that question. You just look and you know immediately that she is angry. You know that as quickly as you know that she has dark hair. We have thoughts and perceptions that happen instantly as soon as we look at things. This looks like a rat. It's in fact a chicken nugget that has a piece of batter that make it look sort of like a tail. And it would not take a whole lot of investigative work to determine that this is not a rat. And yet CNN puts a headline like this: customer orders fried chicken, gets fried rat? Question mark. No, of course it wasn't a fried rat, but it looks like it. The consumer who got this thought it was funny enough. Presumably they had actually inspected it and verified that it was not a rat before taking the picture. Nonetheless, headlines like this get their way out and they make an impression. The way that people read media is typically very quick. This is a wonderful quote from the psychologist David Rand at Yale University. Most people browse Twitter and Facebook to unwind, hardly the mindset you want to adopt when engaging in cognitively demanding tasks like figuring out what the evidence says. So let's not expect people to do anything differently. This is the ecosystem in which we live, and it's also the human brain in which we live. This is how the human brain works. So things like this will get through. Dr. Oz, for centuries we've used astrological signs to examine our personality and how we interact with those around us. However, these signals may reveal a great deal about our health as well. Discover what your astrological sign can tell you about your health. Now, in fairness to Dr. Oz, I haven't actually gone to that link, and I'm secretly hoping that the link says nothing. I can't tell you anything, but it's probably not what the link says. But we browse media. This is entertainment. And I'm not defending Dr. Oz. I'm defending the consumers who read it. This is entertainment. This phrase, knowledge illusion, I think should be a household term, especially for scientists. And the idea is that we tend to think we understand things when we only have general familiarity of them. The term was coined a while ago, but the psychologists Steve Sloman and Phil Fernbach wrote a book called The Knowledge Illusion a couple years ago, highly recommended. They talk about one study of bicycle users, which is pretty much everybody, and they bring people and they say, do you know how to use a bicycle? And of course people say yes, and they say, do you know how a bicycle works? And they say yes. And then they show them the frame of a bicycle and they say, okay, please draw some of the important parts and tell us the story of the mechanism of how it actually manages to propel you from point A to point B. And they get people drawing pictures like this with the chain not connected to the pedals, no sign of any gears. So we often don't really, and I'm not making fun of the person who drew this. I'm not sure that I would have done all that much better. We teach our kids how to use toilets. We don't teach them how toilets work typically. And we typically don't know how most of the things in our daily lives that we use actually work. And that includes the foods that we eat. People talk a lot about metabolism, but they don't know anything about metabolism. Here is a product that claims to be a metabolism booster or something to that effect. And to a reader, that could sound plausible. Oh yeah, I know, I just got a slow metabolism, that's why I gain weight. And they have explanations like that, but they're only based in very loose, familiar concepts. People don't have a sense that metabolism is a series of processes that actually scientists don't understand all that well. And yet it sounds like something I could understand, so we accept it. Knowledge illusion is widespread. It's a fast and automatic process. Once something's familiar, we think we know enough about it to make decisions, when really we know nothing. And there are lots of ways to perpetuate this. This is an image I took from the film What the Health. The person at the bottom is a physician, a vegan activist, and he wants to make a claim that vegan diets will save you from everything more than other diets will. And in the film, he talks about a study that was done with a very small number of people. And he says, after a couple weeks on a vegan diet, the antibodies just cleaned up the cancer cells, just cleaned them all up. And he speaks in familiar language like that. And that's while this cartoon image is showing. And a viewer of this film could get the impression that this is actually a representation of something that someone has seen in a human body. But of course, it's not. It's a cartoon. And to the extent that it represents a biological process that has been hypothesized or observed, if it's been observed anywhere, it's in a petri dish, not actually in a human body. But the viewer can start to think, wow, the science is really there. I can see it on my screen, forgetting that it's a graphic designer who made that image. So fast and automatic knowledge illusion. Our behaviors are fast and automatic too. I think this is one of the best behavioral science books of 2019, written by Wendy Wood, psychology professor at the University of Southern California. Good habits, bad habits. She has this nice quote: we spend a shocking 43% of our day doing things without thinking about them. So our actions are fast and automatic as well. Many psychologists would put that percentage much higher even. Fast and automatic concern, our perceptions of risk. People are terrified of things like terror attacks and plane crashes. And the actual risk from those things is not terribly high compared to some of the actual significant risks that are still of concern, but not of as major concern as the public tends to have. So graphics like this can be very effective. Coming soon, GMO oranges made with pig genes. Our perceptions of risk are driven by feelings, and feelings are fast and automatic processes. They're not driven by objective analysis. There's another great image, and I know you can't read it, so I'll tell you what's here. Chemophobia, this is a study by Jason Lusk, agricultural economist at Purdue University. He asked people, is the food still natural if you add, and he goes through these different ingredients. And the interesting comparison is salt or sodium chloride. Apparently food is still natural, according to about 67% of people if you add salt, but it's only still natural to about a third of people if you add sodium chloride. So that's a perfect example of chemophobia. Sodium chloride is salt. Salt is sodium chloride. So Daniel Kahneman, Nobel psychologist, Nobel laureate in economics, also my postdoc advisor, wrote this book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and this is what really popularized this concept of two systems of human thought: a fast and automatic system that guides the vast majority of what we do, and a slower system which is always playing catch up. And even when it does catch up, it's not necessarily correcting those fast and automatic reactions. It's just creating justifications or reasons for those fast and automatic processes. So Kahneman is not an optimist when it comes to human rationality and what it can do for things like food decisions or anything else. But I think this way of understanding human psychology is incredibly important. It's widespread. It's sort of a working paradigm or framework in most of behavioral science, and I think it should be household language in the ILSI circles. So here's just my last one before I get into some of the details in terms of potential strategies. So as I said, slower thought processes may merely justify rather than check or correct our fast intuitions. So here we see people lining up for reassuring fiction rather than inconvenient truths, sometimes called confirmation bias. So it's human nature to be fast and automatic, and we should get used to this. I want to make the claim that we're not really used to this. One layer of important nutrition communication is through registered dietitians. Brendan McFadden and I did a survey with about 900 registered dietitians last year, and we were asking them about critical thinking, the causes of it, what it is, and what you can do to fix it. So let me show you how that played out. So we said, what is the most important cause of critical thinking failure among consumers? And we gave 4 options. Is it the media? Is it education? Is it lack of knowledge of human nutrition? Or is it human nature? And none of the dietitians, essentially, only 3% said human nature. And that's actually the answer that most behavioral scientists like me would give. We're kind of stuck with this. We are not, our brains are not fundamentally set up for systematic critical thinking. Through culture, we can get ourselves there to be pretty good, but we have lots of processes that get in the way of it, and that's really the first thing to recognize. We can't blame the media. People have been poor critical thinkers since well before there were media, certainly well before there were social media. What's the most important way to prevent critical thinking? We gave responses that were roughly in these three categories: show people better information, show them better reasoning, show them better self-reflection. The vast majority of the dietitians wanted to talk about better information. Better information matters, but it's not the whole story. We're going to talk about, what I want to talk about here is, and that we have a framework, but what I talk about here is this middle bucket around better reasoning. And the general strategy that we recommend if you want people to start reasoning and thinking a little better is, first, deactivate the relevant emotions. And in many cases, that's going to be disgust, whether it's disgust for food or a moral disgust for what the food stands for. It's not until you do that you have any chance of talking about costs and benefits and evidence and such. So in my last few minutes, I'm going to give you a couple examples of ways of deactivating disgust that have been tried and tested by a group of psychologists. And I hinted at these in my beginning example on Ajinomoto. Thank you. Okay, so I've got 4 strategies. I may be only able to describe a couple of them here. But let me give you a couple of details. So strategy 1 is offering a competing moral concern. So in the case of MSG and Ajinomoto, it was about suggesting that there may well be an element of racism here in opposition to MSG. And it's a real claim. We're not making stuff up. And this is what these scientists tried to do in terms of addressing strong opposition to GMO or gene-edited foods. And I want to make one, give you one important term, and that term is absolutist. So what this group of researchers led by Yoel Inbar at the University of Toronto, they've been studying GMO opposition for a number of years, and they have developed this measure of absolute opposition. And absolute opposition is defined roughly as not being willing to consider trade-offs. So there are some GMO opponents who would agree to things like, I oppose GMO no matter how great the benefits of doing it, and no matter how great the costs of not doing it. So that is an absolutist mentality. And what Inbar and his colleagues argue is that very much, and find evidence for, very much of the opposition is absolutist in that sense. And they unpack other evidence that it is as a result, or not actually as a result, as a consequence of it being absolutist is, the initial point is that it's disgust-based or it's emotion-based. There's a disgust reaction to GMOs, and that's what turns people into absolutists. So that's relevant for some of the measures they use, and I'll show you that in a moment. Okay, so here's the first case. They say, what would happen if we offered a competing moral concern through an example like this? So they tell the narrative of golden rice. A nonprofit has used GMO technology to make golden rice, which is high in vitamin A, and it could prevent thousands of cases of blindness. And that's, of course, a competing moral concern. Does having people read about that have an impact on their views of GMO? And in this case, they found that it did have some impact. I'll just spell out the idea a little bit. If a person's objection to something like gene editing or GMOs really is a moral objection, which is ultimately an emotional objection, then perhaps the objection can be reduced by highlighting other competing moral concerns. And did it work? In this case, it did. After being exposed to a competing moral concern, 32% of the absolutist anti-GMO folks softened their stance a little bit and said they were not 100% opposed to GMO. So there may be ways of making some dents in people. Now that's hard to do at mass scale. This is a laboratory study, but I think it points to one of the potential psychological mechanisms. Now, which moral concern would you take on? There are lots of them out there, and of course you need to get the moral concern right. Is it about global sustainability? Or for some American audiences, perhaps it's about progress within America, American technology. Maybe that's part of the story and a moral concern. Or maybe it just has to do with the morality of the future of their own families. But those stories can be told in a way that are very compelling, have a moral layer, and can potentially undo disgust. and we do see some industry groups doing this. This is from innovature.com, from bio.org. I think it's a great site here, just a couple of headlines there. Gene editing is protecting pies and holiday traditions. So there's a moral concern for you. Protecting a biodiversity hotspot. I can't tell if that's Hawaii or where that is, but a compelling moral concern to many people. A second big one is naturalness, and Yoel Imbar and his colleagues tried a similar intervention there. They tell the story of teosinte, the original plant that eventually became our corn. It was bred by ancient Mexicans to make it larger, have larger kernels, and keep the kernels on the stalk. This was accomplished by an introduction of about 6 genes via selective breeding. So selective breeding, changing genes, is natural. Even the ancient Mexicans were doing it. So what happens when you tell stories like that? Does it in fact reduce the feeling of disgust among people who are strongly opposed by making them think, maybe this sort of thing has been going on for a long time, even if it's taken different forms? And they found a 15% reduction in moral absolutism after telling stories like that. Does that generalize? They've tried a couple of cases. I think there's a real craft in how you tell the naturalness story, but I do think this is encouraging evidence that there is a psychological mechanism there that we can use in communication. Which particular naturalness story do you choose? Do you talk about modern broccoli being a selected ancestor of wild mustard? Various narratives that can be chosen. And again, this is from Innovature, framing the naturalness of the human involvement. And it's been happening for millennia. I'll do one more time check because I really do want to end in time. 3 minutes. Okay, I'll go through these last examples fairly quickly just to give you a flavor of them, and then I'll go back to my conclusion slide and wrap up. So tell a good conversion story. This is another compelling approach. It's essentially describing somebody who has changed their mind on a particular technology or issue, or describing how you have changed your mind on a different issue, and maybe that has relevance for your audience on the current issue at hand. I think that's a very powerful mechanism because it shows emotionally your own vulnerability or this other person's vulnerability, and that it's okay to be wrong. So the famous case that's been discussed is Mark Linus, who wrote this great book, Seeds of Science, describing his experience early on as a Greenpeace activist, part of the organization who coined the phrase GMOs, genetically modified organisms, and how he came to, as he read the scientific evidence, believe that actually the story was not nearly so bad, and that the concept of GMOs was not really an appropriate construction, and that the opposition to them should not be as strong because it can actually offer some help in some of the environmental battles that he cared so passionately about. Some researchers actually did a study where they showed videos of Mark Linus, who is of course not a household name, to opponents of GMO. And the videos were of 2 types. Some just featured Mark Linus, who they didn't know, saying, this is why GMOs are good and we should have them. The other story was a conversion message, him describing his own path to believing that GMOs were appropriate. And that latter form that was in the conversion format had a much bigger effect on reducing opposition to GMOs than did simply him telling the story of his interpretation of the scientific evidence. So I think that's another important tool in the communication toolkit for deactivating disgust. I'm going to click through this one quickly. The last tool that I will describe here is increasing familiarity, just making some of the basic science a little more accessible to people. They can experience awe when they hear the science, and that can be a positive thing. There's evidence coming out of the lab of John McPheeters that giving people a little bit of a basic bio course can have some impact on reducing their opposition. I think this can play out even more directly, though, in clinics. There's a great story by this physician describing how she deals with families who are afraid of vaccination of their children. She never talks down to them. She is always very consistent. Vaccination will not hurt your children. In fact, it will help them. It's an incredibly important thing to do. I will respect your decision to not do it, but I'm always going to tell you that you ought to do it. And the way that the transition works when families ultimately decide to do vaccination is not that they say, oh, doctor, I can't believe I've been thinking this way for so long. You're so right. I've read the evidence. And yeah, sure enough, the risks are very small of getting vaccinated, and the benefits are huge. Let's do this. I wish we'd done it years ago. That is not the psychological reaction that people have when they decide to get their kids vaccinated. The reaction they have is, okay, I'll close my eyes, I'll go into the other room, I'll pretend it's not happening, but part of me, doctor, appreciates that you're right, and we've got to do this. So do it. I don't want to see it. I'm still uncomfortable with it, but I get it. And she has to allow a respectful environment that lets people have that reaction, because that's how humans will react. So back to the playbook and the overall story. Let me come back to these. Let me read them again and see if this still resonates. Human decision processes are largely fast and automatic. Fast and automatic processes will not make optimal choices for food or anything. Social media isn't the main problem. It's part of the problem. It's not the main problem. And more information isn't the main solution. Let's stop being surprised that fast and automatic processes are involved. Let's stop pretending that we can just quash them and pretend and have people adopt as their normal behavior the very deliberative, slow processes that the whole scientific institution has tried to do. We need those, but they exist at an institutional level, not at an individual person level. If we want to influence people, influencing the fast and automatic processes should be a central objective, and I've shown you one set of potentially effective approaches that involve deactivating disgust. Thank you.